In May 1945, when Nazi Germany finally laid down its arms and accepted defeat, over 100 German submarines were still prowling the ocean depths. In the days and weeks that followed the surrender, these deadly vessels began emerging from beneath the waves, surfacing in harbors scattered across Europe. Their long and brutal campaign finally at an end. What followed their surrender was something the world had never witnessed before. Hundreds upon hundreds of sophisticated submarines seized by the victorious Allies, carefully examined for their secrets, and then systematically sent to the bottom of the sea in a deliberate act of destruction. This is the untold story of what became of Germany's feared U-boat fleet after the Second World War came to its conclusion. The moment of surrender and its immediate consequences. When May 8, 1945 arrived, Germany put its signature on the documents of unconditional surrender. Almost immediately afterward, Admiral Karl Donitz, who had inherited leadership of Germany from Hitler and who had once commanded the entire U-boat force himself, transmitted a brief but historically momentous command to all submarines still operating at sea. Every U-boat must immediately stop all hostile actions, rise to the surface, and give themselves up to the closest Allied military presence. With those words, the extended war waged beneath the Atlantic Ocean officially came to its end. Throughout the vast stretches of the North Atlantic, across the dangerous waters of the Bay of Biscay, and hidden within the deep fjords along Norway's coastline, more than 150 German submarines began their ascent from the depths. Their weary and defeated crews raised white flags of surrender as Allied reconnaissance aircraft flew protective circles above them. These submarines then began their final voyages toward designated ports, including Loch Eriboll, located in the Scottish Highlands, the harbour at Lisahally in Northern Ireland, and the naval facilities at Portland on England's southern coast. Each arrival represented another quiet marker of the complete collapse of the infamous Wolfpack tactics that had once terrorized Allied merchant shipping across the Atlantic. The process by which these submarines surrendered was conducted under strict Allied supervision and control. Warships belonging to the Royal Navy and United States Navy provided armed escorts as the German vessels made their way into port facilities, where specially trained boarding teams immediately took possession of encryption codes, navigation charts, and all weapon systems. Military engineers carefully documented and catalogued each rusted and battle-damaged submarine, many of which could barely stay afloat after spending months continuously submerged in hostile waters. At the remote Scottish anchorage of Loch Eriboll, nearly 40 U-boats dropped anchor together, creating a somber floating display of total defeat. The sheer scale of the logistical challenge was enormous, coordinating the movement and securing of submarines arriving from ports and hiding places throughout occupied Europe. A number of vessels never completed this final journey, either deliberately scuttled by their own crews or lost to catastrophic mechanical breakdowns before they could reach their designated surrender locations. During the weeks that followed the initial surrender, Allied military and political leaders found themselves confronting an urgent and complex question: what exactly should be done with what was effectively the most technologically advanced submarine fleet that had ever existed? Both the United States and Great Britain recognized the extraordinary intelligence value contained within the revolutionary Type 21 and Type 23 submarine designs, while the Soviet Union, already positioning itself for what would become the Cold War, insisted loudly on receiving its fair portion of the captured German technology and expertise. During this same period, the thousands of captured German submarine crewmen faced long and uncertain months of imprisonment and detention. Some were subjected to intensive interrogation sessions, particularly those engineers and technicians who possessed detailed knowledge of the newest propulsion systems or advanced torpedo technology. Many others simply waited in prisoner of war camps, completely uncertain about what their futures might hold. By the time 1945 drew to a close, the majority of these men had been sent back to a Germany that was now defeated, divided, and occupied. By the end of that first year after surrender, harbours extending from Trondheim in Norway, all the way down to Portsmouth in England, were completely clogged with captured German submarines. What the Allies would do next, through an operation codenamed Deadlight, would guarantee that the vast majority of these sophisticated machines would never sail beneath the waves again. Operation Deadlight and the deliberate destruction of the fleet. As autumn arrived in 1945, the Allied powers had successfully assembled more than 100 surrendered German U-boats in various British port facilities. The ongoing cost of keeping these vessels afloat and guarded was becoming prohibitively expensive, and the idea of storing them permanently was completely impractical. Therefore, the Royal Navy granted approval for an operation designated as Deadlight, which would involve towing all the captured submarines far out into the Atlantic Ocean and deliberately sinking every single one of them. Between the months of November 1945 and February 1946, this quietly executed operation would systematically erase the majority of Germany's kriegsmarine undersea warfare fleet from physical existence. The logistical requirements for this undertaking were truly staggering in their complexity. When the final count was completed, 156 U-boats had surrendered themselves to Allied forces, with 116 of these specifically marked for destruction under the Deadlight operation. The Royal Navy's planners divided the entire operation into 3 separate designated dumping zones, identified only by the letters XX, YY, and ZZ, located roughly 100 to 120 nautical miles to the northwest of Ireland. In these remote ocean locations, the submarines would be sent to the bottom, either through sustained naval gunfire, deliberately placed explosive charges, or by the simple method of opening their sea valves and allowing the ocean to flood in. The operation's first phase commenced in November of 1945, when Royal Navy tugboats began the arduous process of towing groups of submarines away from Scottish and Irish ports toward their final destinations. However, a significant number of the U-boats were in absolutely terrible physical condition. Some had remained continuously at sea for many months without receiving any proper maintenance or repairs. Others bore the visible scars of Allied bombing raids, or had been deliberately sabotaged by their own crews. Their ballast tank systems were riddled with leaks, their diesel engines had seized completely, and their steel hulls had been dangerously weakened by corrosion and rust. Under the harsh conditions of winter storms in the Atlantic, the task of towing these unstable and deteriorating wrecks proved extremely hazardous for the British crews involved. As a direct consequence of these difficulties, more than 1/3 of the designated U-boats never successfully reached the planned scuttling zones at all. 56 vessels either foundered and sank during the towing process, or were dragged down by the combination of rough weather and catastrophic structural failures. The Royal Navy maintained careful records of each loss, but made virtually no attempt to recover or salvage any of these prematurely sunken submarines. The fundamental purpose of Operation Deadlight was destruction, not preservation of any kind. Once the surviving submarines finally arrived at their designated positions, Royal Navy destroyers and frigates moved in to complete the final phase of destruction. British naval crews sometimes employed aerial rockets or sustained volleys of naval gunfire to ensure that each boat descended to the ocean floor as quickly as possible. Among the many submarines condemned to destruction was U-2336, which held the grim distinction of being the very last U-boat to successfully sink Allied shipping during the entire war. This vessel had surrendered at Lissahalli Harbour in June of 1945 and was deliberately sent to the bottom off the Irish coast in January of 1946. Another submarine, designated U-295, suffered the same deliberate fate on December 17, 1945, after being towed from the Scottish port of Lough Ryan. However, not every captured U-boat met the same destructive end. The most technologically advanced examples, particularly the revolutionary Type 21 and Type 23 models, were deliberately spared from destruction so that they could be thoroughly studied by Allied naval engineers. These particular designs represented the genuine future of submarine warfare, featuring dramatically streamlined hull designs and vastly improved capabilities for extended underwater operations. British and American engineering teams examined several of these advanced submarines with extraordinary care and attention, methodically reverse engineering their innovative technologies for incorporation into their own nation's post-war submarine fleets. The U-251, which was Germany's only fully operational Type 1041 submarine by the time the war reached its conclusion, was the very last to be scuttled, going to the bottom on February 7, 1946. This final sinking officially marked the complete conclusion of Operation Deadlight. For many decades following the war, the wrecks from the Deadlight operation lay completely forgotten on the Atlantic seabed, their locations known only from coordinates recorded on old Royal Navy navigation charts. Then, between the years 2001 and 2003, a maritime archaeologist named Innes McCartney organized and led underwater expeditions that successfully rediscovered many of these lost submarines. Using sophisticated sonar equipment and deep-sea photographic technology, his research team positively identified at least 14 U-boat hulls that remained structurally intact, remarkably well preserved in the cold Atlantic mud and silt. The archaeological findings revealed just how hastily the scuttling operations had actually been carried out. Many of the boats had sunk in an upright position, with their deck weaponry still in place, their steel plating now completely encrusted with layers of coral and the accumulated debris of decades of underwater history. Operation Deadlight had successfully achieved its primary objective, the complete erasure of the physical presence of Hitler's U-boat fleet from the world's oceans. Yet the operation's aftermath created an unintended historical legacy, a massive underwater cemetery stretching across sections of the North Atlantic Ocean, serving as silent testimony to the final end of Germany's submarine warfare campaign. Distribution, reuse, and service in Allied navies. While the vast majority of Germany's U-boat fleet found its final resting place at the bottom of the North Atlantic, a carefully selected minority of these submarines managed to survive destruction. For the Allied powers, these particular submarines represented far more than simply defeated enemy vessels or interesting wartime souvenirs. They were living technological blueprints that possessed the potential to fundamentally redefine the entire future of undersea naval warfare. Between the years 1945 and 1948, dozens of these captured submarines were deliberately retained, painstakingly repaired when necessary, and systematically distributed among the victorious Allied nations, where they became crucial test subjects during the opening years of what would become the Cold War. To properly manage this complex allocation process, the Tripartite Naval Commission was formally established in August of 1945. This commission had the responsibility of dividing the surrendered German submarine fleet among the three primary Allied powers: the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. Each of these three nations received 10 U-boats specifically for detailed examination and study, with special priority being given to acquiring examples of the advanced Type 21 and Type 23 submarine designs. These particular models featured dramatically streamlined hull forms, significantly greater electrical battery capacity for extended underwater operations, and sophisticated snorkel breathing systems that represented a revolutionary conceptual leap forward. These were submarines that had been specifically designed to conduct the majority of their combat operations while remaining completely submerged beneath the surface, rather than operating primarily as surface vessels that could submerge temporarily when necessary. In Great Britain, the Royal Navy incorporated several of these captured vessels directly into its testing and evaluation programs. The submarine designated U-3017, which was renamed HMS N41 under British service, underwent extensive submerged operational trials and long-duration endurance testing runs before finally being broken up for scrap metal in 1949. Other captured submarines, such as U-190, which had surrendered off the coast of Newfoundland, were transferred into Canadian naval service, where they functioned as realistic training platforms for for developing improved sonar detection techniques and practicing torpedo attack procedures. The Royal Navy also utilized captured German hull designs to significantly refine and improve their depth charge attack tactics, detonating explosive weapons near authentic German steel construction rather than relying on artificial mock targets or mathematical simulations. The United States military demonstrated a similar level of intense interest in the captured technology. Numerous sea submarines underwent comprehensive examination at major American naval facilities located in Portsmouth and New London. Engineering crews from the United States Submarine Force conducted detailed studies of propulsion system designs, silent running operational technology, and advanced periscope optical systems. These were technological features that would subsequently exert considerable influence on the design of America's first generation of post-war on the dependence of pressure in atmosphere. The plant, camera, and death rate are set up by deep cuts of the casualties. One particularly significant capture was U-234, a specialized long-range cargo-carrying submarine that was seized by American forces on May 14, 1945, while it was still en route to Japan, carrying a secret cargo manifest that included uranium oxide and components for advanced jet engine technology. United States Navy engineers conducted extensive studies of both its specialized construction and its mysterious cargo before finally sinking the vessel during weapons testing experiments conducted in 1947. Throughout Europe, various other national navies received their designated portions of the captured German submarine fleet. The Soviet Union acquired several of the highly prized Type 21 submarines, which subsequently served as direct design templates for what would later become the Soviet Navy's Whiskey-class conventional submarine fleet. Soviet shipyard workers and engineers methodically dissected the captured German hulls, plate by plate, carefully replicating the pressure-resistant architectural design and snorkel breathing systems that provided their newly expanded submarine fleet with a sudden and dramatic technological advancement. For Western military observers, this development represented a deeply worrying strategic concern. The same German engineering expertise that had once hunted Allied merchant convoys across the Atlantic was now actively fueling an increasingly dangerous arms race being conducted beneath the Arctic ice. Several smaller European nations also benefited from access to captured German submarine technology. France, which was engaged in the difficult process of rebuilding its naval forces after enduring years of enemy occupation, acquired a few submarines from the available Allied stockpiles. One of these vessels, the former U-123, continued serving under a new French flag for several years before eventually being decommissioned from active service. Norway operated several others, primarily for crew training purposes and coastal patrol duties, while Denmark successfully incorporated German submarine technology and design principles into its own post-war shipbuilding and naval development programs. However, not every transfer and redistribution of captured U-boats was motivated purely by scientific curiosity or military necessity. The entire redistribution process for these submarines quickly became an early symbolic representation of emerging post-war geopolitical tensions and rivalries. Both Great Britain and the United States had initially hoped that sharing German technological innovations would help maintain a reasonable balance of power among the Allied nations. However, as the Soviet Union rapidly expanded its submarine fleet using captured German designs and technology, what had begun as cooperation between wartime allies quickly transformed into direct strategic competition and rivalry. The ownership of the U-boats had changed hands completely, but their fundamental strategic military value remained as significant as ever. By the time the 1940s drew to a close, the majority of the submarines that had been retained for study and evaluation had served their intended purposes and were either deliberately sunk in weapons tests or completely dismantled for scrap. Nevertheless, their technological influence proved remarkably long-lasting and widespread. The revolutionary innovations incorporated into the Type 21 design, including its advanced battery systems, superior hydrodynamic hull shading, and unprecedented underwater speed capabilities, became the fundamental design foundation for virtually every conventional submarine constructed throughout the entire decade of the 1950s. In a very real historical sense, Germany's final wartime innovation and achievement became the essential blueprint for the nuclear-powered submarine age that would follow. The survivors, museum preservation, and lasting legacy. While hundreds upon hundreds of U-boats were either deliberately scuttled at sea or dismantled in scrapyards, a remarkably small handful of these vessels managed to escape complete destruction and entered into an entirely new chapter of their existence. These surviving submarines, now scattered across locations throughout Europe and North America, underwent a complete transformation from functioning weapons of war into preserved artifacts of historical remembrance and education. Among the most widely known and visited of these survivors is U-995, a submarine that formally surrendered to Allied forces in May of 1945 at the Norwegian port of Trondheim. Following the surrender, this vessel briefly served in the Norwegian Navy under a different designation before being officially returned to West Germany in 1965. Today, this submarine rests permanently at Le Beau, located near the German city of Kiel, where it has been meticulously preserved as a museum ship positioned directly beside the Marine Ehrenmal Naval Memorial. Visitors who choose to step inside this vessel's extremely narrow hull can directly experience the oppressive and claustrophobic living quarters where 45 men once lived, worked, ate, slept, and fought for weeks at a time without ever seeing sunlight or breathing fresh air. In France, several of the captured U-boats were successfully integrated into that nation's post-war naval service. The submarine designated U-123, which was renamed Blazon under French colors, became one of the very few captured German submarines to actually see regular peacetime operational service. When this vessel was finally retired from active duty, it was preserved and placed on public display in the city of Lorient, which had once served as one of the Kriegsmarine's primary U-boat operational bases during the war years. Other surviving submarines can be found in more unusual and unexpected circumstances. The submarine U-534, which was successfully raised from the depths of the Kattegat Strait in 1993, is currently displayed in the English town of Birkenhead. Its entire hull structure has been deliberately cut into separate sections, specifically to reveal the intensely claustrophobic interior spaces to visiting members of the public. Across the Atlantic Ocean in North America, the United States chose to preserve one particularly emblematic submarine for posterity, U-505, which was captured completely intact in June of 1944. After serving as an invaluable intelligence prize throughout the remainder of the war, this vessel was eventually transferred for permanent display at the Museum of Science and Industry, located in Chicago, Illinois. There it remains to this day, having been meticulously restored to museum-quality condition, holding the distinction of being the very first enemy warship ever placed on public display on American territory. However, the vast majority of Germany's U-boat fleet never found their way into museum collections or memorial displays. The numerous wrecks resulting from Operation Deadlight continue to rest on the ocean floor off the northwestern coast of Ireland, collectively forming one of the largest underwater graveyards anywhere in the world. For many decades following the war, these wrecks remained completely forgotten by the public, their locations marked only by coordinations on old Royal Navy navigational charts that few people ever consulted. Public fascination with and interest in the U-boats has only continued to grow stronger with the passage of time. Maritime museums located in Hamburg, Kiel, and Labo attract many thousands of visitors each year, while military historians continue to actively study both the tactical innovations and the individual human lives that existed behind the cold steel. For aging veterans who survived the submarine war, and for modern researchers alike, these preserved submarines represent far more than mere historical relics. They serve as powerful reminders of the terrible human cost exacted beneath the ocean waves during the war. More than 30,000 German submariners lost their lives during the Second World War, along with countless thousands of Allied merchant sailors who perished when their ships were torpedoed. The machines that once symbolized stealth, precision, and technological superiority now stand primarily as symbols representing loss, innovative engineering achievement, and solemn remembrance of those who never returned home. In our present day, the preserved submarines displayed above water and the forgotten wrecks still resting far below the Atlantic surface serve together as twin memorials, one visible to the public eye, one hidden in darkness, jointly telling the final chapter in the story of Germany's submarine fleet. What was once an empire built of steel and driven by ideology now rests in permanent silence, suspended forever between recorded history and the cold depths of the sea. Thank you for watching this presentation. If you found this video informative and engaging, you will likely also enjoy our companion piece titled "What Happened to Germany's Weapons in Tanks After World War II?" Please consider liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and activating the notification bell to ensure you receive alerts for additional content.